it's kind of been a nice homecoming for both of us to come back to Emporia State and visit some people and to meet some new people as well. What I want to talk about today, though, is I know the poster says, you know, what's a history major to do, and you know, given these economic times, that's not a bad question. But I'd like to use my experience in how I got started here at Emporia State and what I did at Louisiana State to kind of illustrate what one person did and how I kind of found my niche in academia and where I'm headed from here. So, and to do that, I want to talk a little bit about the research that I've been doing in the coming of the Civil War and understanding how something in particular, the idea of popular sovereignty and how that played a role in determining what territories in the American West would become slave territories or what territories would become free territories, how that played out, and ultimately how that led to a very unintended consequence of actually, in some ways I would argue, hastening the coming of the Civil War and help fostering the sectional tensions between the North and the South. This all got started upstairs in Professor John Satcher's office, and he's no longer here now, but he was at one time the chair of the Social Sciences Department. And I had a long, circuitous route to where I ended up going to grad school. I started out here at Emporia State in the fall of 1998 as a secondary ed major in social studies and in chemistry, two polar opposites. But it seemed like a great degree option because I would be very marketable. And from there, though, I explored a lot of things, and I was talking with Gwen Larson down in Public Affairs this afternoon, and I was telling her, you know, there were so many opportunities here at Emporia State to look at different things, try different things, and you were able to do that here in ways that I might not have been able to at a larger university. And I had a lot of patient faculty who were able to put up with me bouncing here and there and everywhere, trying to figure out some of the things I was interested in. Well, by the time I had finished my master's thesis, which was a study of a locally prominent newspaper editor who was sort of the big guy in this part of the state before William Allen White came about in the 1890s and before he became famous, I had become intrigued by an idea that was totally different, and it was this idea of popular sovereignty and the issue of determining what territories in the American West would become slave territories and which ones would become free territories. And the traditional story that's always prevailed is that, well, this idea came up around 1854, that people back in Congress, particularly a gentleman by the name of Stephen Douglas, had decided, you know, this issue of slavery was dividing the nation. It was dividing Congress as well, and it was making it nearly impossible for politicians in Washington, D.C. to get their job done, whatever that job was. And that was becoming an increasingly unclear problem. How could this nation hold together even though both North and South were becoming very nervous about the slavery issue and that issue was becoming very problematic in and of itself for the different sections of the nation. And so the traditional story goes, this Stephen Douglas comes up with this idea, says, you know, this is none of Congress's business. Says, you know what, America's a democracy. And let's get back to good old democratic ideals, and let's let the people in the territories decide whether they want slavery or not. Sounds beautiful. You know, great idea, American democracy in action. And then it falls apart. You know, Bleeding Kansas, John Brown, you know, and all of these events that start here in eastern Kansas start to fall, and like dominoes, the slavery issue becomes the all-consuming issue in American politics and in American society. And being a good Kansas boy, I had grown up in Olathe, had stayed in Kansas to, came to Emporia to get my education, and I said, there's got to be more to this story than just Kansas. This issue of who had the right to decide where slaves could go or where slaves could not go had to come from somewhere else. And so I started rooting around, and this was when I had my discussion with John Satcher upstairs on the 4th floor of Plum Hall, and I asked him, I said, you think this would be a good dissertation topic? He said, I think it might. I think you ought to take a look at it and see just what was going on. And so that was the question I started with, and I think whether you're in the arts or whether you're in the sciences, engineering, whatever, the one thing that sort of unites us across this campus and across any college campus is people get questions in their heads and they really want an answer to that. And this was the question that got into my head. So, popular sovereignty, this idea and this traditional story, I really wanted to take a look at that and see, do we have it right? What was the context that was involved in this idea of deciding, well, we can have the people in the territories themselves determine whether they want slavery within their domain or not. As I kept digging, and I was an archive rat, I loved getting into old newspapers and reading letters and getting into the archives. As I kept digging, I kept finding clues that kept pointing me earlier and earlier into the 19th century. And eventually, I ended up into the late 18th century even. And one of the things that I've learned from all of this is if you really want to understand why the Civil War came, why it happened, why the North and South divided, you really can't just look at the 10, 12, 15 years before the Civil War. You really need to look at the entire American experience from the time that the Constitution was written in 1787 on up to 1861 when Beauregard ordered the shelling of that fort out in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter. So I kept digging, and I found that in 1846 and into 1848, a number of Democrats in the North had been talking about stuff that went far beyond Kansas. Kansas and Nebraska weren't even in their minds yet. This was still the Great American Desert, what Zebulon Pike had called it in 1803. And for those of you who have driven across I-70, you might think that's kind of an apt term still. But I found that there were a group of Democratic politicians in the North, one from Pennsylvania, one from New York, and one from Michigan, who were very interested in quieting this dispute over slavery in 1846 and 1848, or into 1848. And so I start looking at what these men were talking about, George Dallas, Daniel Dickinson, and Lewis Cass. And I start reading their writings. And they were concerned at that time period with, well, what do we do with the Mexican Cession? That vast territory, present-day California, New Mexico, on up into Utah, all of that land that we got from Mexico from the Mexican War. And this had become an issue then, well, should slavery exist in that territory, or shouldn't it? And these three men each proposed a slightly different version of what would come to be known as popular sovereignty in the 1850s. And they're saying the same things that Stephen Douglas was saying in 1854. They're saying, no, this is not Congress's problem. Let's let the people in the territories decide whether they want slavery or not. Now again, and I'm at the risk of sounding repetitive, I'll say it sounds beautiful. The main problem was, who were the people? Who were the people in these territories? Well, in 1854, the people in Kansas really depended on how close to election day you were, because Kansas was pretty sparsely populated until election day. And then, you know, anywhere from 5, 10, maybe 12,000 Missourians would flood across that border, and Kansas's population would swell, and the ballot boxes would fill full of bogus ballots on in elections. In 1846 and 47 and 48, it was a different story. The native Mexicans who had lived in places like California and New Mexico made up the broad segment of the population out in this Mexican cession that the United States received from the nation of Mexico. And they were all rabidly anti-slavery. Slavery had been outlawed under Mexican law. And the thought that